My son-in-law called me, too old to babysit. Then begged me. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but here I am, 73 years old, with trembling hands and a heart that still aches from what happened 6 months ago. They say time heals all wounds, but some words cut so deep that the scar tissue never quite forms properly. Today, I need to tell someone, anyone, about the day my son-in-law called me too old to babysit, and what happened when he desperately needed me to prove him wrong. My name is Eleanor, and for the past 8 years, being a grandmother has been the greatest joy of my life. When my daughter Sarah gave birth to little Emma, I thought my heart might burst from the sheer magnitude of love I felt. 2 years later, when baby James arrived, I knew without a doubt that these 2 little souls had given my life new purpose. From the very beginning, I was the grandmother who said yes to everything. Need someone to watch the kids while you run errands? I'm there. Want to go on a date night? Consider it done. Emergency at work? Don't worry, Grandma Ellie will handle everything, and I loved every single minute of it. Sarah would call me, sometimes apologetically, asking if I could help out, and I'd practically leap through the phone with enthusiasm. Of course, sweetheart, I'd say, already mentally planning what games we'd play and what treats I'd make. The truth was, those children weren't just my grandchildren. They were my lifeline to feeling young, useful, and deeply, profoundly needed. I remember the first time I kept Emma overnight when she was just 6 months old. Sarah was nervous, writing out detailed instructions about feeding schedules and sleep routines. But the moment that baby was in my arms, muscle memory kicked in. I'd raised 3 children of my own, including Sarah, and some things you never forget. That night, Emma slept peacefully in the little crib we'd set up in my guest room, and I felt like I was living in a beautiful dream. As the children grew, so did our traditions. Every Wednesday, I'd pick them up after school. Well, Emma from kindergarten and James from daycare. And we'd have our special Grandma and Me afternoons. I'd taught myself to braid hair properly again just so I could do Emma's pigtails exactly the way she liked them. We'd bake cookies together, flour inevitably ending up in our hair and on the kitchen floor. James, still small enough to need a step stool, would help me measure ingredients, his chubby little fingers carefully counting out chocolate chips. Our story time was sacred. Every evening I babysat, we'd curl up on my old velvet couch, the one Sarah always said I should replace, and I'd read from the same worn copy of fairy tales I'd once read to her. Emma loved Cinderella, while James preferred the 3 Bears. Their eyes would grow wide at all the right moments, just as Sarah's had 30 years ago. Sometimes, if I was feeling particularly creative, I'd make up stories about brave princesses who looked suspiciously like Emma, or adventurous boys who shared James' dimpled smile. I kept a special drawer in my kitchen filled with child-safe treasures, colorful measuring cups, wooden spoons for drumming, and a collection of cookie cutters in every shape imaginable. My refrigerator was a gallery of their artwork, held up by magnets I'd collected from every trip I'd ever taken. The house that had felt too quiet since my husband passed 5 years ago was suddenly filled with laughter, tiny footsteps, and the wonderful chaos that only children can bring. The children adored me, and I basked in their unconditional love. Emma would run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, knowing that Grandma Ellie always had magical Band-Aids and the perfect words to make everything better. James would fall asleep in my lap during afternoon cartoons, his little hand clutching my finger as if he never wanted to let me go. These moments weren't just precious to me, they were everything. Sarah often told me how grateful she was. "Mom, I don't know what we'd do without you," she'd say. and I could see the relief in her eyes. Balancing work and motherhood was exhausting for her, just as it had been for me decades ago. But unlike me, she had help. She had a mother who was healthy, energetic, and completely devoted to making her life easier. My son-in-law, David, seemed appreciative too, at least in the beginning. He'd thank me politely when he came home to find dinner made and children bathed and ready for bed. Sometimes he'd joke about how I spoiled them, but it never seemed mean-spirited. He was building his career, working long hours at his engineering firm, and I understood the pressure he was under. I was happy to help wherever I could. I should have noticed the changes sooner. Looking back, there were signs, small comments, subtle shifts in his demeanor. David had always been somewhat reserved around me, but gradually he became more distant, more critical. He'd make offhand remarks about old-fashioned parenting methods or suggest that the children needed to be toughened up instead of coddled by their grandmother. When I taught Emma to knit, just simple stitches to start with, David rolled his eyes and muttered something about useless skills in the modern world. When I showed James how to plant seeds in little pots on my windowsill, David questioned whether it was age-appropriate for a 4-year-old. These comments stung, but I brushed them off, telling myself he was just stressed from work. The truth was, David had always been slightly uncomfortable with how close the children were to me. I think he felt threatened by the special bond we shared, worried that I was somehow undermining his authority as their father. But I was careful never to contradict him in front of the children, never to make them feel caught between us. I respected his role, even when I disagreed with his methods. Then came the incident with the playground. It was a beautiful autumn Saturday, and I had both children for the day while Sarah and David attended a work conference. We went to our favorite park, the one with the big oak tree and the newer playground equipment. Emma, now 7, was becoming quite the little athlete, climbing monkey bars and racing across balance beams with impressive skill. James, at 5, was more cautious but determined to keep up with his big sister. I was pushing him on the swings when it happened. Emma called to me from the top of the climbing structure, wanting to show off her latest trick. For just a moment, maybe 30 seconds at most, I took my eyes off James to watch Emma's performance. In that brief instant, James decided to jump off the swing mid-flight, something I'd told him never to do. He landed hard on his knee, scraping it badly on the mulch. It wasn't serious, just a typical childhood injury that would heal in a week. But there was blood, and he was crying loudly. I scooped him up, cleaned the wound with water from my bottle, applied one of the special Band-Aids I always carried, and held him until the tears stopped. Emma hovered nearby, worried about her little brother, until I assured her he was okay. By the time we got home, James was already bragging about his battle scar and asking if he could show it to his friends at school. The drama was over, forgotten in the way that only children can forget. But when David saw the bandaged knee, his reaction was swift and harsh. "What exactly happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. I explained about the playground, trying to keep my tone light and reassuring. "You know how active he is," I said with a smile. "Just a little tumble, nothing serious." David's face darkened. "You were supposed to be watching him." "I was watching him," I replied, feeling the first flutter of anxiety in my chest. I looked away for just a moment to see Emma. "That's the problem," he interrupted. "You can't keep up with both of them anymore. You're 73 years old, Eleanor. Maybe it's time to admit you're getting too old for this." The words hit me like a physical blow. Too old. The phrase echoed in my mind as I stood there, still holding James's small hand, feeling suddenly ancient and useless. "David," Sarah said quietly from the doorway. She'd been listening, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, but he wasn't finished. "I'm serious, Sarah. Your mother means well, but she doesn't have the reflexes she used to have. What if something worse had happened? What if James had broken a bone or hit his head? We can't keep pretending that age doesn't matter when it comes to child safety." I wanted to defend myself, to point out that children get hurt sometimes, no matter how carefully they're supervised. I wanted to remind him of all the times I'd cared for his children without incident, all the hours of love and attention I'd given them. Instead, I stood there in stunned silence, feeling like a scolded child myself. Sarah tried to mediate. "Mom has been watching kids for decades," she said carefully. "This was just an accident." "That's exactly my point," David replied. "Decades. She was great when you were little, but that was 30 years ago. Times have changed, safety standards have changed, and let's be honest, she's changed too." The room fell silent except for the sound of James playing with his toy cars, oblivious to the tension around him. Emma had retreated to the corner, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. "I think I should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked torn, glancing between her husband and her mother with obvious distress. "Mom, you don't have to." "No, it's fine," I lied, gathering my purse and coat with shaking hands. "David's probably right. Maybe I am getting too old for this." As I walked to my car, I heard James calling after me. "Grandma Ellie, are you coming back tomorrow?" His innocent voice nearly broke me completely. I drove home in a haze of hurt and humiliation. Too old. The words played on repeat in my mind as I sat in my empty kitchen, staring at the refrigerator covered in my grandchildren's artwork. Too old to be trusted with the children I loved more than life itself. Too old to be the grandmother I'd always been. Too old to matter. That night, I took down all the children's drawings and put them in a box. I cleaned out the special drawer in my kitchen, packing away the cookie cutters and colorful measuring cups. I even considered donating the little beds I'd bought for my guest room, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. Some small part of me hoped this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would blow over. Sarah called the next morning, her voice heavy with guilt and exhaustion. "Mom, about yesterday." "It's okay, sweetheart," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. Maybe David has a point. Maybe I should step back a little. "You don't have to do that," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was caught between loyalty to her mother and loyalty to her husband, and I didn't want to make that choice harder for her. "Let's just give it some time," I suggested. "Let things settle down." But things didn't settle down. They got worse. The calls for babysitting stopped almost entirely. When Sarah did ask for help, it was awkwardly phrased, as if she were imposing on me rather than giving me the greatest joy in my life. David would barely acknowledge me when I did come over, treating me like a barely tolerated visitor, rather than a beloved family member. The Wednesday afternoon tradition ended abruptly. Sarah explained that they'd enrolled the children in after-school programs instead. "It's good for them to socialize with other kids," she said, not meeting my eyes. But I knew the real reason. David had decided I couldn't be trusted alone with his children. The hardest part was seeing the confusion in Emma and James's eyes. They didn't understand why Grandma Ellie wasn't coming around as much anymore. When they asked about our baking days and story times, I'd make vague excuses about being busy, not wanting them to know they were caught in the middle of an adult disagreement. I tried to fill my days with other activities. I joined a book club at the library, volunteered at a local charity, even took up watercolor painting at the community center. But nothing compared to the joy I'd felt with my grandchildren. The house felt empty again, the way it had after my husband died, only worse because this emptiness was a choice, David's choice to cut me out of my grandchildren's daily lives. Months passed. I saw the children at family dinners and holiday gatherings, but it wasn't the same. Our special bond was being slowly severed by limited contact and David's obvious disapproval. I watched Emma grow more independent, less likely to run to me with her small problems. James, still young enough to be openly affectionate, would ask repeatedly when I was coming to play at his house again, breaking my heart a little more each time. I began to doubt myself. Maybe David was right. Maybe I was too old, too slow, too set in my ways. Maybe modern children needed different kinds of care than I could provide. Late at night, I'd lie in bed replaying every moment I'd spent with my grandchildren, wondering if I'd missed other signs of my inadequacy. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Thursday morning in March when my phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Sarah's voice was strained and panicked. "Mom, I need help. David's father had a heart attack last night. We're driving to Chicago right now. We need to be there as soon as possible. The kids are still sleeping, and I can't take them out of school, and our usual babysitter is sick, and—" "I'll be right there," I said, already reaching for my car keys. "Are you sure? I know things have been weird lately, and David didn't want me to call you, but I don't have anyone else, and—" "Sarah," I interrupted gently, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I drove through the quiet morning streets with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. David hadn't wanted Sarah to call me. Of course he hadn't, but here they were, in a crisis, and suddenly my age and supposed inadequacy weren't quite as important as having someone reliable to watch his children. When I arrived, Sarah met me at the door with tears in her eyes. She looked exhausted and worried, already dressed and ready to leave. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what we would have done." David appeared behind her, car keys in hand, his face a mask of reluctant gratitude. "Eleanor," he said stiffly, "thank you for coming." I simply nodded. This wasn't the time for old grievances. Sarah rattled off instructions, school pickup times, emergency contacts, meal preferences, but most of it was information I'd known for years. "Don't worry about anything," I assured her. "Just focus on being with family. The children will be fine." As they drove away, I felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over me. Whatever had happened between David and me, whatever hurtful words had been spoken, these children still needed their grandmother. And I was still the woman who had successfully raised 3 children of her own, who had decades of experience caring for little ones, who loved Emma and James more than anything in the world. The day began normally enough. I woke the children gently, helped them get dressed and ready for school, made their favorite breakfast of pancakes shaped like animals. Emma chattered about an upcoming school play, while James proudly showed me how he could tie his own shoes now, almost correctly. It felt wonderful to slip back into our old routine, even temporarily. But around lunchtime, James started complaining that his tummy hurt. At first, I thought it might just be worry about his parents being away, but when he threw up twice and developed a fever, I knew this was more serious. I called the pediatrician's office and was told to bring him in immediately. There was a stomach bug going around, and with his symptoms, he needed to be seen right away. This was exactly the kind of situation David had worried about, a medical emergency while the children were in my care. For a moment, I felt that familiar flutter of self-doubt. What if I made the wrong decision? What if I wasn't capable of handling this properly? But then James looked up at me with his big brown eyes, so trusting despite feeling terrible, and my grandmother instincts kicked in completely. I'd dealt with sick children before. I knew what needed to be done. I called Emma's school to arrange for early pickup, explaining the situation to her teacher. Then, I carefully bundled James in a blanket and drove to the pediatrician's office, stopping only to call Sarah and leave a message about what was happening. At the doctor's office, James clung to me while the nurse took his temperature and the doctor examined him. It was indeed a stomach virus, unpleasant but not dangerous. The doctor prescribed medication and recommended plenty of fluids and rest. James would need to stay home from school for a few days, but he'd be fine. "Are you his grandmother?" the doctor asked as she wrote out the prescription. "Yes," I said, suddenly wondering if she thought I was too old to be handling this alone. "Well, you certainly know what you're doing," she said with a warm smile. "You got him here quickly, and you've been keeping track of his symptoms very accurately. He's lucky to have such an attentive caregiver." Those words meant more to me than she could possibly know. The next few days were challenging, but rewarding in ways I'd almost forgotten. James was clingy and cranky from being sick, needing constant comfort and attention. Emma worried about her little brother and missed her parents, requiring extra reassurance and affection. I managed medications, monitored temperatures, prepared special foods for sensitive stomachs, entertained a bored recovering child, helped with homework, maintained bedtime routines, and provided the emotional support both children needed. I was tired. There was no denying that. Caring for a sick child is exhausting at any age, but I was also energized by the knowledge that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. These children needed their grandmother, and I was fully capable of meeting that need. On Saturday morning, when James's fever finally broke and he woke up asking for chocolate chip pancakes, I knew we'd weathered the storm successfully. Emma helped me make breakfast, chattering happily about how glad she was that her brother was feeling better. As we sat around the kitchen table, sharing pancakes and silly jokes, I felt more like myself than I had in months. That afternoon, Sarah and David returned from Chicago. David's father was stable and recovering. The immediate crisis had passed, and they were both grateful to be home. Sarah rushed to hug the children, while David stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. "How did everything go?" Sarah asked, scanning the children's faces for signs of distress or neglect. "Grandma Ellie took really good care of us," Emma announced proudly. "James was sick, but she made him all better. She made special soup and told us stories, and even let us build a blanket fort in the living room. She took me to the doctor when my tummy hurt real bad," James added, climbing into my lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And she stayed up with me when I couldn't sleep because I felt yucky." Sarah looked relieved and grateful, but David's expression was harder to read. He surveyed the house, which was clean and organized despite having hosted 2 children for 4 days, one of them sick. He noticed the completed homework assignments stacked neatly on the counter, the children's bright faces, the comfortable way they interacted with me. "James was sick?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. I explained what had happened, the symptoms, the doctor's visit, the diagnosis, and treatment. I showed him the medication schedule I'd maintained and the notes I'd taken about James's progress. David listened quietly, asking appropriate questions, nodding at my responses. "You handled that well," he said finally, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. He'd expected disaster, evidence of my inadequacy. Instead, he'd found proof of competent, loving care. But the real moment of truth came the next week. I was grocery shopping on Tuesday afternoon when I got an emergency call from Sarah. Emma had fallen at school and hit her head on the playground equipment. The school nurse thought she might have a concussion and recommended immediate medical attention. Sarah was in an important meeting she couldn't leave, and David was in a conference call with international clients that couldn't be rescheduled. "Can you get to the school?" Sarah asked frantically. "I know it's a lot to ask, especially after everything, but—" "I'm already in my car," I said, abandoning my grocery cart and heading for the parking lot. At the school, I found Emma sitting in the nurse's office with an ice pack pressed to her forehead, looking pale and scared, but trying to be brave. The moment she saw me, tears started flowing. "Grandma Ellie, my head really hurts." I gathered her into my arms, my heart aching at her obvious pain and fear. The nurse explained what had happened and her concerns about a possible head injury. We needed to get Emma to the emergency room immediately. The next few hours were a blur of medical forms, waiting rooms, and anxious moments. Emma needed a CT scan to rule out serious injury, and she was frightened by all the medical equipment and unfamiliar faces. I stayed by her side through everything, holding her hand during the scan, distracting her with stories and songs, advocating with the medical staff to ensure she received the best care. Thankfully, the scan showed no serious injury, just a mild concussion that would require rest and monitoring for the next few days. Emma would need to stay home from school and avoid strenuous activities, but she'd be fine. By the time Sarah and David arrived at the hospital, Emma was feeling much better and proudly showing off the special stickers the nurses had given her. She recounted her adventure to her parents in dramatic detail, making sure to emphasize how brave she'd been and how Grandma Ellie had stayed with her the whole time. David pulled me aside while Sarah was signing discharge papers. "Eleanor, thank you for being there. for handling this so well. I know Emma was scared, and having you with her made all the difference." There was something different in his voice, a recognition, maybe even respect. "She's my granddaughter," I said simply. Of course I was going to be there. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "About what I said before, about the playground incident, I think I may have overreacted." I waited, not making it easy for him. "You've been taking care of children longer than I've been alive," he continued, "and this week, watching how you handled James being sick, and now this with Emma, I can see that experience counts for something." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. More than I'd expected from him. "I was never trying to undermine you as their father," I said quietly. "I just wanted to help. I wanted to be part of their lives." "I know that now," he said. I think I felt threatened. Like maybe you were better at this than I was. Like the kids preferred you to me. It made me defensive." His honesty surprised me. "They love you, David. You're their father. Nothing I do could ever change that or compete with that." We stood in silence for a moment, watching Emma charm the hospital staff with her chatter about her very important head injury. "Would you," he started, then stopped. "Would you be willing to go back to our old arrangement? The Wednesday afternoons, helping out when we need it? I think the kids have really missed spending time with you." I looked at Emma, animated and happy despite her bandaged forehead, and thought about James asking repeatedly when I was coming back to play. "I'd love that," I said. But I also knew things couldn't go back exactly as they were. I was older now than when this all started. That was simply a fact. And David's concerns, however poorly expressed, weren't entirely without merit. "But maybe we should talk about guidelines," I added. "Ways to make sure everyone feels comfortable and confident." He nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you think would help." Over the following weeks, we worked out a new system. I still took the children for Wednesday afternoons, but David and Sarah created detailed emergency contact lists and gave me clear instructions about when to call them versus when to handle situations independently. We discussed my comfort level with various activities and locations. They acknowledged my experience and judgment, while I accepted reasonable safety precautions. More importantly, David began treating me as a valued team member rather than a barely tolerated outsider. He asked for my advice about parenting challenges, shared funny stories about the children's antics, and even started joining our conversations instead of retreating to his office when I was around. The children, sensing the improved atmosphere, blossomed. Emma started sharing her school problems with me again, confident that I wouldn't disappear from her life unexpectedly. James resumed his habit of falling asleep in my lap during our Sunday family dinners, secure in the knowledge that Grandma Ellie would always be there. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with Sarah. The tension between us, that awful feeling of being caught between her mother and her husband, finally eased. She began calling me just to chat again, sharing details about her work and asking for my perspectives on various decisions. Our mother-daughter bond, strained by months of conflict, slowly healed. Looking back now, I realize that David's cruel words, "too old to babysit," came from a place of insecurity and fear rather than malice. He was a relatively new father, trying to protect his children in the only way he knew how. When he said I was too old, he was really expressing his own anxiety about keeping them safe, about being a good parent, about living up to the enormous responsibility of raising small humans. That doesn't excuse the hurt he caused me or the months of doubt and isolation that followed, but understanding his motivations has made it easier to forgive him and move forward. Today, as I write this, Emma is 8 and James is 6. They're growing so fast it sometimes takes my breath away. Emma is learning to play piano and has developed strong opinions about everything from homework to hairstyles. James has decided he wants to be either a dinosaur expert or a fire truck when he grows up, and he practices for both careers with equal dedication. They still spend Wednesday afternoons with me, still help me bake cookies and tend to my garden, still curl up on my old velvet couch for story time. But they're also more independent now, more capable of entertaining themselves, more aware of the adult dynamics around them. Sometimes I catch Emma studying my face when I'm tired, as if she's trying to assess my well-being. James occasionally asks if I'm feeling okay when I move a little more slowly than usual. They're protective of me now, in ways that both touch my heart and remind me that I am, indeed, getting older. Not too old to love them, not too old to care for them, not too old to be an important part of their lives, but older nonetheless. I've learned to accept this gracefully. I take vitamins to maintain my energy, exercise regularly to keep my strength up, and stay current with child safety recommendations. I've also learned to ask for help when I need it, and to communicate more clearly about my capabilities and limitations. Most importantly, I've learned that being needed isn't the same as being indispensable. My worth as a grandmother doesn't depend on being the only person who can care for Emma and James. It comes from the unique love I offer them, the special relationship we've built, the particular ways I can enrich their lives. David still sometimes watches me with slight wariness when I'm with the children, but it's the natural caution of a parent, rather than the dismissive judgment of before. When Emma scraped her knee last month while we were at the park, ironically, the same park where James had his accident, David's first question was whether she was okay, not whose fault it was. The other day, as I was reading to James before his afternoon nap, he looked up at me with those serious brown eyes and said, "Grandma Ellie, are you going to be my grandma forever?" "Forever and always," I promised him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Even when I'm really, really old?" "Even when you're really, really old." He smiled and snuggled closer. "Good. I would miss you too much if you weren't my grandma anymore." Children have such a simple, pure way of expressing love. In James's world, the only thing that matters is that I'm his grandma and I love him. My age, my energy level, my occasional creaky joints, none of that factors into his equation. I am his Grandma Ellie, and that's enough. It's taken me months to fully believe this again, to trust that my value to these children isn't diminished by the passage of time. David's words shook my confidence in ways I'm still recovering from. But watching Emma's face light up when she sees me across her school playground, feeling James's complete trust as he falls asleep in my arms, seeing how naturally they turn to me for comfort and guidance, these moments remind me that love isn't bound by age limits. I may be 73 years old. I may move a little slower than I used to, tire a little more easily, need reading glasses for the bedtime stories. But I am not too old to be a grandmother. I am not too old to matter. I am not too old to be exactly what Emma and James need me to be. And when David desperately needed me to prove him wrong, when his father's heart attack left them with no other options, when James fell sick and needed experienced care, when Emma was hurt and scared at the hospital, I was there. Not because I had to prove a point, but because that's what grandmothers do. We show up. We take care of the ones we love. We do whatever needs to be done. The truth is, David did beg me. Not with words, perhaps, but with actions. Every emergency call to ask for my help was an admission that he'd been wrong. Every grateful thank you was an acknowledgement of my continued value. Every moment of watching me successfully care for his children was proof that experience and love matter more than the number of candles on a birthday cake. I'm grateful now for what happened, as painful as it was at the time. It forced all of us to examine our assumptions and communicate more clearly about our needs and expectations. It taught me to value myself independently of others' opinions. It showed David that his fears were largely unfounded and that partnership is stronger than control. Most of all, it reminded me that being a grandmother isn't just about babysitting or helping out in emergencies. It's about being a constant, loving presence in these children's lives. It's about offering them a different perspective, a special kind of unconditional love, a connection to their family history and values. I am their Grandma Ellie. I'm not too old for that title, and I never will be. That's not about age, it's about love. And love, I've learned, has no expiration date.